Pick that up, sweetheart." That is what Dr. Whitfield said 17 minutes before a former insurgent commander whispered her battlefield call sign in Arabic. Laura Bennett moves through Seattle General in Portland like a shadow, scrubs perpetually wrinkled, hair in a functional bun, hands that never shake even when starting fours on screaming toddlers. The fluorescent lights hum above the pediatric ward where she checks vitals with mechanical precision, her movements too efficient, too controlled, like someone trained to work while buildings collapse around them. In her locker sits a tarnished challenge coin from Baghdad, edges worn smooth from 18 years of her thumb running across it during 3 a.m. moments in parking garages. She has a slight limp from an old injury, favors her left leg when standing too long, though no one here would think to ask why a nurse moves like she's calculating distance to exits. The other nurses avoid her, competent but cold, helpful but distant. She doesn't join their break room conversations about dating apps and Netflix shows. She doesn't laugh at their jokes. She signs the patient charts with Laura Bennett, RN, in handwriting that could belong to anyone. The badge clipped to her scrub pocket says staff nurse and shows a photo taken with her hair down, softer features, a name that isn't hers. Deep cover means invisible. Invisible means the classified mission parameters stay classified. When Commander Hayes arrives at the ER carrying his 8-year-old deaf son Ethan, Laura watches from the nurse's station as the boy stumbles against his father's chest. Not stumbling. Seizing. The kind of seizure that moves through a body like electricity through copper wire, rigid, then loose, then rigid again. Hayes is still in uniform, Navy working blues, the gold dolphins on his chest catching the harsh ER lighting. His hands are steady. A SEAL's hands are always steady. But his eyes are not. His eyes are the eyes of a father who has already survived the worst war knows to throw at him and now faces something worse, his son's body betraying him in ways he cannot fight. Dr. Whitfield emerges from the back, chart in hand, moving with the deliberate slowness of a man who has never been questioned in his own hospital. He's 54, according to the hospital directory. $60,000 in student debt forgiven 12 years ago. Budget cuts pending. Equipment scanners in his department haven't been updated since 2019. 3 board members owe him buried malpractice incidents, the kind that quietly disappear when you know the right people. His power moves like steam through corridors, subtle, pervasive, invisible unless you know to look for it. Mr. Hayes. Whitfield extends his hand. The handshake lasts exactly 3 seconds. Let's take a look at young Ethan. He examines the boy for 2 minutes 56 seconds. Laura counts. She counts everything now. Counting is survival. Whitfield checks reflexes with a small rubber hammer, shines a penlight in Ethan's eyes, asks the boy standard neurological questions that Hayes signs so his son can understand the words. Ethan answers in ASL, hands moving with the fluid grace of a child who has always communicated this way. Laura recognizes the signs. She learned ASL at Naval Special Warfare Command during her 3rd deployment, spent 6 weeks with an interpreter who lost her brother in Kandahar. Learning a language becomes less about linguistics and more about honoring the dead when the person teaching you still cries in the bathroom during lunch breaks. Behavioral, Whitfield says. Not a question. A diagnosis delivered like a verdict. Children this age sometimes manifest stress through physical episodes. Seizure-like episodes, specifically. Has there been trauma? Parental conflict. Hayes stands rigid. A SEAL commander standing in an ER being asked if his son is having a psychosomatic crisis is like a surgeon being asked if his trembling hands are nerves. The question itself is the insult. My son, Hayes says slowly, has never had a seizure in his life until 6 days ago. 3 episodes. I need advanced imaging. An MRI. Now. Whitfield folds the chart. The gesture is small. Dismissive. Our MRI is currently in maintenance. We'll schedule imaging for next week, run some labs, and I'd like to refer you to pediatric psychiatry to rule out behavioral. No. Laura's voice comes from the nurse's station. She doesn't stand. She doesn't raise her hand. She simply speaks into the space between them, her tone flat and clinical. The MRI on the 3rd floor has been operational since Tuesday morning. Lab work won't tell you what's happening in his brain during these episodes. The ER goes quiet. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of something heavier, the silence that falls when someone speaks outside the hierarchy. Whitfield turns. His face doesn't change, but something hardens behind his eyes, something that calculates and catalogues and remembers. "Thank you, Ms. Bennett. I'll manage the care." It isn't a request. It's a statement of dominion. Laura returns to her monitors. The room resumes its ambient chaos, beeping monitors, coded radio calls, the wheeze of a ventilator in Trauma Bay 2. But Whitfield is watching her now. People with power always remember the moment someone questions it. For hours later, Laura sits in the hospital cafeteria with a tray of something the kitchen calls chicken, though the meat has the color and texture of something that lived a very brief life in industrial fluorescent lighting. She sits alone at a corner table, her back to the wall, eyes on the exits, old habits that have never quite left even in hospitals that will never be combat zones. Whitfield approaches from her left side. He's carrying a tray of his own, the good chicken from the attending physician section, but that's not his actual target. His actual target is the space 3 feet to her left where nothing important sits, just air and opportunity. He walks deliberately into her periphery. "Excuse me," he says, though he doesn't move aside. Laura looks up. Their eyes meet for 2 seconds, the exact duration of a threat assessment. She shifts her tray. He doesn't sidestep. He sweeps his hand through the motion anyway, and her tray goes vertical. The plate launches across the white linoleum like something launched from a catapult. Chicken, rice, gravy, and vegetables scatter across 12 square feet of floor. The sound is the sound of ceramics shattering, sharp, final, audible to every staff member within 20 feet of them. 30 people stop. 30 people watch. 30 people know exactly what just happened and no one says a word. Laura's jaw clench is so small it's almost invisible. Her hands remain folded in her lap. She does not tremble. She does not stand abruptly. She does not speak. She simply sits there as every eye in the room swings from the shattered tray to her face, watching to see what she will do. What she will become. Whitfield moves to pass her. She stands in one fluid motion and walks toward the mess, toward the custodian station, toward the paper towels and the small mop. The room watches her bend and begin collecting the pieces. Every fragment. Every grain of rice. Every smear of gravy and chicken with the deliberate care of someone cleaning a crime scene. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Whitfield says loudly enough for the entire cafeteria to hear. He's standing over her, chart in hand, his tone the tone of an adult speaking to a child who needs reminding of her place. "You made quite a mess." She did not make a mess. She is holding the pieces of her shattered tray. But the distinction doesn't matter. The statement was never about the tray. It was about audience. It was about establishing in front of 30 witnesses that he can knock things out of her hands and she will pick them up. It was about proving that hierarchy, that dominion, that power works the way he says it works. Laura stands with the shattered pieces in her hands and the wet napkins dripping gravy onto the linoleum. She does not make eye contact. She does not speak. She walks to the trash bin and deposits the debris. She washes her hands for 47 seconds at the sink. She returns to the cafeteria line and obtains a replacement tray. She returns to her corner table and sits with her back to the wall, her eyes on the exits, eating mechanically while the room slowly resumes its conversations. But the conversations are different now. Smaller. Quieter. Like something has shifted in the air pressure, like everyone can feel the moment when someone's power expanded and someone else's contracted. Whitfield walks past her on his way out. She doesn't acknowledge him. She doesn't acknowledge anything. She simply continues eating, her hand steady as surgical steel, her composure so complete it amounts to a kind of violence, the quiet violence of someone who has already decided how far down she will bow and how far she will not. What they didn't know was how close that decision was to fracturing everything. 3 days later, Laura assists in an emergency appendectomy. The patient is a Navy SEAL's 8-year-old son who seizes on the table, the same boy, Ethan Hayes, whose imaging finally happened after his father went up the chain of command and spoke to the hospital administrator. The surgery is chaotic and precise. Ethan's appendix has already ruptured. Peritonitis is beginning. Time margin is 14 minutes before septic shock becomes irreversible. Laura moves through the procedure with muscle memory so complete it amounts to instinct. She has done this before. Not appendectomies. Trauma surgery. Pericardiocentesis under fire. Chest tube placement by flashlight in the dark of a collapsed building. Her hands remember what her brain is trained not to say out loud. She sutures with 3 layers, the deep layer, the muscle layer, the skin layer, each knot pulled with exactly the same tension, each stitch placed at precisely 45-degree angles. The technique is distinctive. Military field training. Combat surgery under constraints that don't exist in civilian hospitals. A traveling surgical nurse from the Marine Corps Wounded Warrior Battalion is assisting. His name tag says Mitchell. His eyes are the color of someone who has seen things in trauma bays that don't belong in peace. He watches Laura's hands move across the incision. He watches the 3-layer closure. He watches the precision and the speed and the muscle memory that has no business existing in a RN who has spent the last 2 years rotating through pediatric ward floors. Their eyes lock across the surgical field. Mitchell's jaw tightens. His hand hesitates for approximately 1 second, the duration of someone making a calculation that changes everything. Then he leans in, his voice dropped to barely above a whisper, mouth close enough that only Laura can hear him across the blue surgical drapes and the beeping monitors and the sound of Ethan's breathing through the ventilator tube. Fallujah? The word comes out not as a question but as a recognition. A statement of something known and now confirmed. Laura's eyes do not widen. Her hands do not pause. Her breathing does not change. She simply continues closing the wound and, after exactly 2 seconds of silence that stretches like a held breath, shakes her head. No. Not Fallujah. Somewhere deeper. Somewhere darker. Somewhere that doesn't exist on public maps. Mitchell nods once. Slowly. The kind of nod that says, I know what you are now. I know who you are. I will not speak of it. And then he turns his attention back to the bleeding, back to the retractors, back to helping her finish saving a commander's 8-year-old son while neither of them acknowledges that at least one person in the room now carries a secret that will echo through everything that comes after. The sutures hold. The bleeding stops. Sinus rhythm returns. O2 climbs to 98% and holds steady. But the moment when another warrior recognized the warrior standing across from her, that moment has already begun. A countdown neither of them has started. The next morning, Laura found Dr. Whitfield waiting at the nurse's station with Ethan's chart in his hand. Nurse Bennett. Did you recommend an MRI to Commander Hayes' family? Without consulting me. His voice carried across the entire floor, loud enough that 3 residents froze mid-conversation. Laura kept her eyes on her paperwork, her hand steady as they scrolled through the electronic medication log. I mentioned it was an option, Doctor. Whitfield leaned close, his breath coffee-sour and invasive. You're a nurse. You mentioned bedpans and ice chips. Leave diagnostics to people with actual medical degrees. He emphasized the last 2 words like he was speaking to someone who didn't understand English. Laura nodded once. Understood. She didn't flinch. The residents watched, uncomfortable, unsure whether to stay or leave. Whitfield walked away satisfied, having drawn blood in front of witnesses. That became the pattern. By Tuesday, he started calling her a clipboard in front of staff, never her name, always the diminutive nickname delivered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Clipboard, fetch me those labs. Clipboard, try not to think too hard, you might hurt yourself. Each time, Laura nodded and complied without comment. No defiance. No sass. Just the quiet acceptance of someone who knew her place in his hierarchy. Other nurses began to look away when he spoke to her, embarrassed on her behalf or afraid to catch his attention by association. By Thursday, the weight of it had settled into the hospital like humidity before a storm. The cafeteria incident happened at lunch. Laura carried her tray past Whitfield's table, where he sat with two board members, men in tailored suits who controlled hospital budgets and personnel decisions. She'd been reviewing Ethan's chart between bites of soup, her eyes catching details that made her chest tighten, white blood cell count climbing steadily upward, fever spiking to 103.4 degrees, lethargy documented by his father as who's sleeping 16 hours a day now. Classic infection markers. Meningitis. Sepsis. Things that killed children in hours if you waited too long. Whitfield stood abruptly as she passed, intercepting her trajectory with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this before, humiliation as choreography. Still playing doctor, clipboard. He didn't wait for an answer. His hand moved like a backhanded swipe, but his timing was precise, controlled. The tray tipped from her grip. Soup and silverware exploded across the tile floor in a violent bloom of red and steel. The cafeteria went dead silent. 40 staff members stopped mid-chew, mid-conversation, mid-breath. Whitfield picked Ethan's chart from her other hand, flipped through it with exaggerated confusion, then threw it at her feet. Paper scattered like snow across the spilled soup. Pick that up, sweetheart. Stick to what you're qualified for. His voice was gentle, conversational, the kind of cruelty that cuts deepest because it's delivered with a smile. Laura knelt. Her hands gathered every page methodically, her movements precise and unhurried. The rubber soles of her shoes whispered against the wet tile as she shifted position. A piece of paper had soaked up soup, she wrung it gently before adding it to the pile. Her face showed nothing, no flush, no tears, no anger. Just the blank, professional composure of someone trained to function under conditions that would break most people. Her knuckles whitened slightly around the chart as she stood, but her voice remained level. I'll get this cleaned up, doctor. She turned toward the custodial station, already reaching for paper towels. The nurses nearby began to whisper. She heard fragments, that was brutal, and did he really just, but she didn't turn. Didn't react. Didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing anything break. That afternoon, Whitfield called her into his office. The door closed with the kind of softness that made the moment feel official, consequential. I'm giving you the worst shifts for the next month. Night rotation. Pediatrics. Prove you can handle real nursing before you question my diagnoses again. Laura stood across from his desk, her posture perfectly neutral. Understood, doctor. 4 words. All he got. He smiled like he'd won something. The night shifts removed her from critical cases and from Ethan's medical care during daylight hours, when Whitfield made rounds and decisions. She worked 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., feeding the hospital's night machinery, checking monitors, administering scheduled medications, watching over patients who were mostly asleep or sedated. It was busy work designed to diminish her, and it worked. She wasn't there when Whitfield examined Ethan at 2 p.m. on Monday. Wasn't there when Commander Hayes begged for advanced imaging. Wasn't there to hear Whitfield refuse, again, because imaging would require documentation that forced accountability, and Whitfield's budget scandal couldn't survive scrutiny. By Friday, Whitfield had escalated to systematic destruction. He called in favors from 3 board members who owed him for things he'd buried, malpractice incidents, equipment failures, patient safety violations that never made it into official records. A phone call to each one. I have a nurse problem. Someone who doesn't understand chain of command. I'm going to need your support when I move forward with documentation. The board members said yes before he finished the first sentence. They always did. Then came the references. Whitfield had someone from his office call the 3 nursing schools listed on Laura's application. The callers asked specific questions designed to trap inconsistencies. Can you confirm she completed her BSN in 2018? What was her GPA in pharmacology? Did she have any disciplinary incidents? Laura's fabricated background held, naval intelligence had built it carefully, with real transcripts, real digital trails, real references that traced back to front organizations. But the calls were a message. Whitfield was pulling threads, looking for any inconsistency that might expose her. By the following Tuesday, an outside HR investigator named Patricia Moss arrived at Seattle General with a leather portfolio and the kind of expression people wore when they were paid to destroy someone. She set up an office on the third floor, technically separate from administration, technically neutral. She spent her first day reviewing every incident report Laura had ever filed, every schedule she'd worked, every patient interaction documented in electronic records. Laura watched from a distance as Moss spoke quietly with nurses who'd witnessed the cafeteria incident. She was building a case for insubordination, systematically collecting evidence that would hold up in a termination meeting. The realization hit Laura on Wednesday night during a 2 a.m. medication round. Her cover was collapsing. Not fast enough to panic anyone, but fast enough that she could see the timeline. Whitfield would push for termination within 2 weeks. By the end of the month, she'd be escorted from the building, her nursing credentials permanently questioned, her ability to work in hospitals in Oregon finished. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 floors up, in a secured pediatric suite, a 9-year-old girl named Asha Patel sat under armed security. Her father was a visiting diplomat from India, high-value asset, classified threat assessment, credible intelligence that an extremist cell had marked his family for abduction. Laura's assignment had been simple: maintain medical proximity to Asha under the cover of nursing, monitor for any breach of security protocols, report immediately to her Navy intelligence handler if anything felt compromised. 18 months of deep cover. 18 months of learning hospital systems, building trusted relationships, establishing access. If Laura lost her job, she lost her clearance to work in the hospital. She lost proximity to Asha. She lost her mission. Naval intelligence had been explicit: maintain cover at all costs. The assignment overrides all other considerations. If a patient needs help but helping them blows your cover, you let them suffer. You let them die. That's the contract you sign when you become an operator. Your mission matters more than individual lives. Sounds monstrous until you understand the geometry: one girl's life versus an operation that protects 30,000 civilians. Ethan Hayes was not her mission. Ethan Hayes was a complication. That evening, Laura sat in her car in the parking garage on level 3, engine cold, forehead pressed against the steering wheel. The parking garage smelled like motor oil and exhaust, that automotive rust and gasoline signature that made her think of forward operating bases and convoy routes through Fallujah. Rain hammered the windshield like applause nobody wanted. She sat there for 40 minutes without moving, without starting the engine, without reaching for her phone. The challenge coin sat in her cup holder, tarnished silver, stamped with the insignia of her SEAL team unit. Baghdad, 2011. 3rd Platoon. The coin was something she should have left behind, should have never carried into deep cover. Metal traces, physical evidence, the kind of mistake operators don't make. But she'd carried it anyway. One tiny piece of her real identity. One small defiance of protocol. She picked it up now, turned it over in her palm. The weight of it was nothing, maybe 2 ounces. But it carried everything else. 73 combat missions. 42 lives pulled from incoming fire. 2 Purple Hearts for rounds that had found meat instead of armor. 1 Bronze Star for an operation that would never be declassified. The men she'd trained with, the ones who'd recognized her suturing technique across an operating table and whispered a single word like a prayer. She set the coin back in the cup holder and finally started the engine. The next morning, she clocked in for night shift and learned that Patricia Moss had scheduled a formal investigation meeting for Monday at 9 a.m. Laura was to bring a representative if she wished. It was over. Not officially, not yet, but mathematically inevitable. By next week, her fabricated nursing career would be terminated. By the week after, her real identity would either remain classified or explode across headlines depending on what Whitfield's investigation uncovered. Either way, she'd already lost the thing that mattered most. The crash came at 9:44 a.m. on a Wednesday, metal on linoleum, the sound of a body hitting the floor hard enough to echo down the pediatric corridor. Laura was 3 rooms away checking a post-op patient's surgical drain when her head snapped toward the noise. She didn't deliberate. Didn't pause to consider protocol or procedure. The sound had already told her everything: velocity, weight, the specific acoustic signature of a child collapsing without warning. She moved. Her legs carried her down the hallway with the fluid precision of muscle memory rewired through 1,000 combat deployments. The soles of her boots struck the linoleum in a rhythm that sounded like a helicopter's distant thud. Pediatric Ward 4, Bed 12. The door was open. Commander Hayes stood frozen in the doorway, his face the color of old bone, one hand still reaching toward his son as if he could pull the moment backward. Ethan was on the floor. The boy's small body convulsed in tight, rigid cycles, not the flailing seizure of a typical child, but something worse, something that spoke of pressure building inside the skull like hydraulic force against bone. His eyes had rolled back so far only the whites showed, 2 crescents of egg-white horror. His neck was stiff, locked, his tiny fists clenched so hard his fingernails had drawn blood into his palms. Fever radiated off him like a space heater. Laura could feel it from 2 feet away, the heat of infection, the smell of sweat and something else, something medicinal and wrong, the particular stench of meningitis that once learned is never forgotten. She dropped to her knees beside him. No hesitation. No glance toward protocol or permission. Get me room temperature saline and a cool compress. Now. The pediatric nurse standing in the doorway didn't move. Move. Laura's voice had dropped an octave, the commanding tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed by people who carried guns. The nurse moved. Laura's hands found Ethan's face. She lifted one eyelid and watched the pupil, blown wide, unresponsive, different from the other side. Unequal pupils. Neck stiffness so severe she could feel it even as the seizure locked him tighter. Temperature check, 104.1 on the temporal thermometer. This wasn't behavioral. This wasn't anxiety or psychological. This was increased intracranial pressure, the kind of pressure that builds when infection swells the brain tissue itself, pressure that would kill him if not relieved in minutes instead of hours. Where is Dr. Whitfield? Commander Hayes's voice cracked like old ice. He was still standing frozen in the doorway, watching his son convulse on the floor with an expression Laura had seen before, on the faces of Taliban fighters' families after drone strikes, the particular paralysis of witnessing something irreversible. Where is he? Hayes repeated, louder now. Laura didn't answer. She was already paging Whitfield's emergency line. Code 5, Pediatric Ward, Collapsed Patient, Neurological Emergency. The page went through. The system acknowledged it. No callback. She paged again. 30 seconds. 60. Nothing but the mechanical beep of the monitor and Ethan's shallow, labored breathing. He's at a medical conference, the ward clerk called from her desk. Off-site. He's not available until 1 o'clock. Dr. Ramirez is in emergency surgery. Dr. Chen is. 3 hours. Commander Hayes moved forward, his hand reaching for his son again. My son is dying in the next 3 minutes and you're telling me no one is available. Laura's peripheral vision caught the saturation monitor. O2 was dropping. 94, 92. The boy's breathing had become shallow, rapid, panicked. His body was fighting itself, the seizure burning through oxygen reserves faster than his lungs could replace them. Cerebral edema. That was what this was. Swelling of the brain tissue itself, pressing against the skull vault with no room to expand. Every second the pressure mounted, neurons died. Every second without intervention was permanent damage or death. I need a lumbar puncture kit, Laura said. Her voice was steady, factual, the tone of someone making a grocery list instead of a decision that would cost her everything. The pediatric nurse's face went white. Laura, you can't. You're not. Lumbar puncture kit. Sterile field. 25-gauge needle. Now. We need physician approval. Whitfield has to. Dr. Whitfield is unreachable and this child is dying. Laura's eyes didn't leave Ethan's face. She was already running through the procedure in her hands, the tactile memory of 100 field lumbar punctures in combat zones where medical school was 60 kilometers away and irrelevant. I can attempt the procedure without approval or we can wait 90 minutes for an available attending. Pick one. The nurse hesitated. Commander Hayes made the decision for her. Do it. Whatever you need to do. The next 5 minutes existed in a state outside normal time. The pediatric team assembled the sterile kit with hands that moved in synchronized precision born from hundreds of practiced routines. Laura scrubbed her hands with antiseptic that smelled like industrial bleach and regret. She positioned Ethan on his side, his spine curved in the classic C-shape that opens the space between the lumbar vertebrae, L4 or L5, the same anatomical landmark she'd used to extract infected cerebrospinal fluid from dying Marines in the mountains of Helmand Province 13 years ago. The muscle memory was absolute. 25-gauge needle, midline approach, she said, and someone pressed it into her palm before the words finished leaving her mouth. The needle was cool, smooth stainless steel, the weight of it familiar in her hand like a weapon she'd put down and picked up again. She found the space by feel, the resistance of ligament giving way to the sudden absence of resistance, the distinctive pop that meant she'd entered the subarachnoid space. She'd hit it on the first attempt. She always did. The cerebrospinal fluid that came back into the collection tube was cloudy, thick, the color of watered milk. Not clear. Never supposed to be cloudy. Cloudy CSF meant one thing and one thing only, bacterial infection. Meningitis. Maybe encephalitis. The kind of infection that kills children every 6 hours if not treated with antibiotics, the kind that leaves survivors deaf or brain damaged or both. Get me ceftriaxone, Laura said. 2 grams 4. And call microbiology. I need this sample processed emergent. She was already moving, already drawing the medication into a syringe, the label reading 2G a vial, standard meningitis protocol, the dosage burned into her muscle memory from a trauma medicine rotation in Baghdad where bacterial meningitis moved through military housing like wildfire and she'd personally administered this exact medication to 12 soldiers before lunch. She injected the antibiotic into Ethan's foreline and stepped back. The room had gone so quiet she could hear the fluorescent lights humming their monotonous drone, the particular electrical buzz of hospital overhead lighting that sounds like insects trapped inside a wall. Ethan's body was still now, the seizure activity halting, his breathing slowing from panic to measured. O2 saturation climbed, 94. 96, 98. Sinus rhythm on the monitor, the blessed steady beep of a heart finding its baseline again. 3 minutes. That was how long it took for the antibiotic to begin crossing the blood-brain barrier, for inflammation to subside, for a child's brain to stop swelling inside the vault of his skull. 3 minutes to the difference between life and permanent disability. Commander Hayes moved to his son's side. He was crying now, his face wet, his hand reaching out to touch Ethan's small shoulder with the tenderness of someone who'd almost lost something irreplaceable. "You saved him," he said. His voice was broken, fractured, the sound of a SEAL commander watching his child come back from the edge. "You saved my son's life." Bacterial meningitis, Laura said, her own voice remaining level, clinical, the tone of a nurse reporting findings. Needs for antibiotics for 7 to 10 days. Isolation protocol for the first 24 hours. He'll need a follow-up with neurology to rule out complications, but his prognosis is good. She didn't mention that if she'd waited 60 seconds longer, Ethan would have suffered permanent brain damage. She didn't mention that if she'd waited 2 minutes, his heart would have stopped. She didn't mention any of it, because mentioning it would make it real, and if she made it real, she'd have to acknowledge what she'd just done. She'd violated protocol. She'd performed a procedure without attending physician approval, a fireable offense under any hospital's bylaws, a violation of nursing scope that could cost her not just this job but every job, every credential she'd built in the civilian world. She'd made a choice that prioritized a child's life over her career, and even knowing it was the right choice, even knowing she'd made the exact same decision 1,000 times in combat zones where protocols were suggestions from people safely in offices 10,000 miles away. Even knowing all of that, she understood what she'd just set in motion. Dr. Whitfield would hear about this before the end of the day. His investigation team already had her in their sights, had fabricated references, had board members gathering evidence. This would be the final piece. The proof they needed. Protocol violation. Scope creep. Insubordination. Everything Whitfield needed to end her. But Ethan Hayes was alive. The boy's breathing was steady now, his color returning to something like normal, the fever still there but no longer spiking toward lethal, his small body stabilizing with each passing minute. Alive. Awake. His deaf eyes meeting his father's hearing ones with the clarity of a child who'd almost died and didn't understand how close he'd come. That was the trade. That was the price. Laura turned to leave the room, her mission parameters screaming in her mind: maintain cover, don't break protocol. The diplomat's daughter 2 floors up was still the priority, stay under the radar, don't expose yourself. But those parameters had been written by people in offices who'd never stood in a pediatric ward and watched a child seize to death. She moved down the hallway toward documentation, toward the electronic medical record system, toward entering the procedure notes that would become evidence against her, every keystroke a confirmation that she'd made the choice that would end her time at Seattle General, that would blow her cover, that would end 2 years of deep cover operation for a mission that now felt impossibly distant. But that wasn't the worst part. The electronic medical record system hummed beneath Laura's fingertips as she entered the lumbar puncture findings, cerebrospinal fluid analysis confirming bacterial meningitis, white blood cell count elevated to 847 cells per milliliter, glucose level critically depressed, protein through the roof. Clinical evidence. Medical necessity. The exact documentation that would prove she'd been right and that she'd violated every protocol in the hospital to do it. She was halfway through the antibiotic administration notes when Whitfield appeared in the doorway of the nurse's station like a man who'd just discovered his house was burning. For hours. That's how long it had taken him to return from his morning meetings downtown, walk through the pediatric wing, see the treatment notes, and realize what Laura had done. You performed a lumbar puncture without attending physician authorization. His voice didn't ask. It detonated. The words echoed down 3 hallways, bouncing off every surface like shrapnel. Staff froze. A resident dropped a chart. A med student looked up from her computer with widening eyes. This was the kind of yelling that made everyone pretend to be busy while listening intently. Laura stood. Slow. Deliberate. No apology in her movement, no defensive posture. Her hands remained steady on the desk's edge. The patient was critical. Decreased level of consciousness. Suspected meningitis. You were unreachable for 43 minutes. I made a clinical judgment based on available evidence. You made nothing. Whitfield's neck had developed a web of bulging veins. His face had gone the color of raw meat. You are a nurse. A bedside provider. You violated 17 different protocols in this hospital, and he stepped closer, voice dropping to something colder than the shouting had been. You just handed me exactly what I needed. The room had gone entirely silent. Rubber gloves weren't snapping. Keyboards had stopped clicking. 14 staff members had materialized at various workstations, all of them pretending to work while their entire nervous systems were tuned to this moment. This was theater now. This was Whitfield's stage. Laura's jaw tightened imperceptibly. That was all. Just the smallest compression of muscle, the kind of thing only someone trained to read violence would notice. Her eyes remained fixed on Whitfield's with the flat, unreactive quality of someone who'd been trained to give enemies nothing, not fear, not anger, not even acknowledgement of their words. My office. Now. Whitfield didn't wait for her response. He turned and walked, assuming obedience the way men with power always did. But that wasn't the worst part. Within 2 hours, Whitfield had activated every network he'd built over 18 years of institutional climbing. He placed calls to 3 board members, voices smooth and reasonable as he outlined his concerns about liability, about a nurse operating outside her scope of practice, about the lawsuit risk of a child sustaining complications from an unauthorized invasive procedure. He didn't mention that the procedure had saved the child's life. He didn't mention that Ethan Hayes was already showing signs of improvement, meningeal inflammation beginning to respond to antibiotics. He mentioned only protocol violation and institutional risk. The 3 board members he called were the ones who owed him. One had buried a malpractice incident involving a patient death from a preventable medication error. Another had utilized Whitfield's connections to quash an investigation into suspicious billing patterns in the radiology department. The third had needed help making a problematic lawsuit disappear for years ago. When you owed a man like Whitfield, you answered his calls. "I'm concerned about the precedent this sets," Whitfield said to each of them, his voice carrying the reasonable tone of someone advocating for institutional integrity rather than personal vindication. A nurse overstepping her authority, making unilateral medical decisions. The liability exposure is significant. I wanted to give you the courtesy of hearing it directly. By 6 o'clock that evening, Whitfield had called Laura's nursing references. The 2 numbers on her file rang back to secure lines in Northern Virginia, naval intelligence fronts, voices trained to maintain cover. The woman who answered the first call identified herself as the director of nursing at a civilian medical facility that officially had a staff of 47 and unofficially operated as a Pentagon briefing room. She confirmed that yes, Laura had worked in their system, that her credentials were in order, that her references checked out. But the hesitation before each answer, the formal precision of the language, the absolute refusal to offer any detail beyond the bare minimum, Whitfield heard it all. Inconsistency. Evasion. The sound of a lie told by professionals. He smelled blood in the water now. By midnight, he'd contacted an outside HR investigator named Patricia Sorensen, a former hospital administrator who specialized in building airtight termination cases against employees. Whitfield met her at a coffee shop near the Lloyd district, and he laid out his case with the precision of a prosecutor. Unauthorized medical procedure. Scope of practice violation. Pattern of boundary-crossing behavior. He provided the incident reports he'd filed, carefully documented, meticulously dated, building a narrative of an increasingly problematic employee. Sorensen was efficient. She interviewed 6 staff members about Laura's history at the hospital. A resident reported that Laura had once suggested a different approach to a patient's treatment plan. Was that overstepping? A nursing assistant mentioned that Laura had rearranged some supply protocols in the pediatric ward. Was that initiative or insubordination? A tech recalled that Laura had stayed late multiple times to monitor a critically ill patient. Dedication or possessiveness? Each person interviewed had liked Laura, respected her work, but Sorensen knew how to reframe observations into concerns, how to transform professional competence into suspicious behavior. By dawn, the file was 3 inches thick. Allegation. Corroboration. Documentation. Pattern. Precedent. It was beautiful, really, the architecture of institutional destruction, built by someone who understood how bureaucracy worked better than most people understood their own families. The next morning, Whitfield walked into his office and made one phone call to security. Deactivate the badge for Laura Bennett, Seattle General Nursing Staff. Effective immediately. She is to be escorted from the premises. No exceptions. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Security arrived at the nurses' station at 7:24 a.m., exactly when the day shift was transitioning in, exactly when the maximum number of staff would be present to witness what was about to happen. 2 guards in Navy uniforms, faces professionally blank, the kind of men trained to execute institutional orders without asking questions. "Miss Bennett? We need to escort you from the building. You're no longer authorized to be on hospital property." Laura had been updating end-of-shift notes. She closed the chart, removed her badge from around her neck, the laminated photograph showing her civilian identity, 3 months of work compressed into a 2-inch ID, and placed it on the desk. She stood. The guards flanked her, 1 on each side, and began walking her toward the exit. The perp walk. That was what this was. That was what Whitfield had orchestrated. A nurse being escorted from a hospital by security, the visual equivalent of being dragged through town in shame, the message to every staff member crystalline and permanent: this is what happens when you challenge the system, when you step outside your designated place, when you assume you know better than the authority above you. They passed the ER. Every doctor, every nurse, every patient waiting for care turned to watch. A young resident's jaw went slack. A med student whispered something to the nurse beside her. An elderly woman in a wheelchair stared with an expression caught between pity and fear. In the lobby, Whitfield stood with his arms crossed over his chest, face arranged in the expression of a man who'd been wronged and had finally achieved justice. He made eye contact with Laura as she walked past, and in that single moment, his triumph was absolute. But Laura's face showed nothing. No anger. No shame. No defeat. Her posture remained perfect, her stride even and measured, her eyes fixed forward with the flat quality of someone looking through a moment rather than being present in it. Her jaw was set tight enough to cut steel, but from a distance it just looked like composure. Professional. Almost serene. She didn't argue. She didn't demand a conversation with HR. She didn't cry or shake or attempt to defend herself. She walked between the guards with the same efficiency she used in everything else, direct, economical, emotionless. It was the composure of someone who'd walked into worse situations armed with less, and she carried it like a shield. The parking garage was concrete and shadows, fluorescent lights humming overhead with the sound of 1,000 angry bees. Security stopped at her car, a grey sedan with 3 years of northwest rain wearing into the paint. One guard nodded. They'd fulfilled their obligation. Laura opened the door and sat in the driver's seat. The guards left. Their footsteps echoed and faded. For 40 minutes, she sat with the engine off. Forehead pressed against the steering wheel. Hands gripping the rim hard enough to turn her knuckles white. The parking garage was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the cold of being erased, of 2 years of careful work dissolving like chalk in rain. The diplomat's daughter. 7th floor, pediatric cardiac care. Critical security threat level still active, still unmonitored now, still potentially exposed because Laura was sitting in a parking garage with her forehead against a steering wheel, unable to even turn the key in the ignition. The mission failure was cascading now, branching into consequences she couldn't track or prevent. The tarnished military challenge coin sat in the cup holder, oxidized silver and iron mold into the DevGru insignia. Years of carried weight, compressed into a 1.5-inch circle. She'd never thought of it as mockery before, but in this moment it felt exactly like that, proof of everything she'd been, everything she'd built, everything she'd sacrificed, all of it now irrelevant in a parking garage in Portland where she was nobody. Not a master chief. Not a warrior. Just a fired nurse. She'd been under fire. She'd been surrounded by enemies. She'd been shot at and blown up and left for dead in places where the temperature hit 134 degrees at noon. But she'd never felt defeated until this moment, sitting in a cold car with her hand shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the specific tremor that comes from holding composure so tight for so long that the restraint itself becomes physical. The key stayed in her pocket. The engine stayed silent. Thunder rolled across the city in the distance, a storm moving in from the west, carrying rain that would hammer the parking garage like judgment for the next 3 days. 3 days of rain hammered Portland like judgment, the kind of storm that made the ER busier than usual. Laura had spent 72 hours sitting in her apartment, watching the news cycle bury her name, the tarnished challenge coin from her unit in Baghdad pressed between her palms at 3 in the morning. She didn't cry. She didn't call her handler. She just waited, knowing her cover was gone and the diplomat's daughter 2 floors up was still in danger with no one watching anymore. Her phone stayed silent. No rescue order. No extraction. Nothing. Then Seattle General called with a code, critical condition trauma arriving by ambulance in 4 minutes, and the nursing shortage meant they were activating her one last time before the termination paperwork went final. Laura was there in her scrubs before the ambulance doors opened, muscle memory carrying her into the ER like her hands knew what her brain couldn't accept, that some things didn't care if your life was falling apart. The patient was a man in his late 40s, dark skin burned and weathered, eyes moving in the panicked rhythm of someone running from something worse than death. He was wheeled straight to Trauma Bay 3, already in shock, blood loss significant, chest wound that needed pericardiocentesis for cardiac tamponade if they were going to keep his heart pumping for the next 10 minutes. Laura moved with him, hand steady, starting a 16-gauge for with one motion while a resident rattled off vitals. Blood pressure 74/40. Heart rate 142. Respiratory rate 32. The man was drowning inside his own chest cavity. She didn't recognize him until his eyes locked on hers, really locked on hers, and his hand shot out, seizing her wrist with the grip of a dying man or a terrified one, and the Arabic words that came out of his mouth in a whisper made everything stop. Khalat al-Assad, he gasped. The lioness. Laura's jaw tightened exactly 1 millimeter. No one else in the trauma bay saw it. She didn't pull away. She didn't flinch. She just kept working, prepping the needle for pericardiocentesis, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this in field tents under fire, and she leaned close enough that only he could hear, lie still. I'm going to save your life. Then you're going to explain to me why a former insurgent commander from the Jolin district is seeking asylum in Portland. The man's eyes went wider. He released her wrist. You're supposed to be. Shush. She positioned the needle at the 5th intercostal space, left mid-axillary line, advanced it slowly into the pericardial sac. The hiss of air escaping sounded like a tire deflating, but it was blood, dark, thick, backing up against his heart. 40 milliliters drained into the chamber. 50. The cardiac monitor's rhythm clicked back into something almost healthy. Pressure's coming up, the resident said, relief flooding his voice. 98/60. Laura didn't respond. She was still looking at the man on the stretcher, and his eyes were still locked on hers, and in that moment of absolute clarity, something shifted in the room, a presence that made the fluorescent light seem dimmer, as if the hospital itself sensed what was standing in its trauma bay. Ethan's father, Commander Hayes, had been waiting outside pediatrics when Laura finally finished with the insurgent commander's stabilization. The boy had crashed twice in the previous 72 hours, his meningitis finally responding to the antibiotics Laura's lumbar puncture had made possible, and now he was awake, coherent, signing with his hands in that beautiful fluid language that had nothing to do with sound. Laura had been visiting him unofficially, bringing books, sitting with him, being the person nobody remembered seeing. She was leaving his room when the retired Navy chief from security rounded the corner, a man named Holloway who'd done 2 tours in Kandahar and recognized the military bearing in her walk even when she was wearing scrubs. He heard the Arabic words that had echoed through the ER, carried on the PA system into every corner of the hospital. He heard Khalat al-Assad and his body went rigid, the way a bomb detection dog goes rigid when it catches a scent. He stood there, in the corridor outside pediatrics, understanding flooding his face, and then he walked directly to the central nursing station where 40 staff members were charting, finishing up the shift change, and his voice came out like a command, carrying the weight of someone who had seen combat. That's Master Chief Petty Officer Bennett. 3 bronze stars. 2 purple hearts. She just saved that man's life in Trauma Bay 3. The room didn't go dead silent. It went something worse than silent. It went into that specific kind of quiet that happens when reality violently rearranges itself. Pen stopped moving. Monitors seemed to stop beeping. The ventilator in the next room was the only sound, that mechanical wheeze, and even that sounded like it was holding its breath. Laura stood at Ethan's doorway, 50 feet away, completely motionless. She didn't look at them. She didn't acknowledge Holloway's announcement. She just finished buttoning her jacket and turned back toward the pediatric ward, moving like someone whose entire career wasn't about to explode into public record. But a rear admiral was walking through the hospital, visiting for a board meeting, ironically reviewing hospital credentialing after a consultant had flagged some irregularities in Dr. Whitfield's employment authorization. He heard the words. He understood them. And before Laura could reach the elevator, he was walking toward her, dress uniform crisp as a scalpel blade, and he was reading from his phone with the calm precision of someone delivering a mission briefing. 73 combat missions. Personal record of saving 42 lives under direct fire. Kuwait, Iraq, Afghanistan, 3 separate deployments. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Master Chief Bennett operated under federal authorization on a classified assignment. Her employment here was critical to a national security objective. The silence lasted exactly 10 full seconds. Laura could count them. She'd learned to count seconds like some people learn to breathe. Then Holloway stepped back into the nursing station and saluted. Not casually. Not partially. Full hand to temple, formal as a funeral. 2 other veterans, a respiratory therapist and a phlebotomist, followed. Then a cardiac nurse who had a Marine Corps tattoo on her wrist. Then a surgeon. Then half the staff, because they finally understood what they were standing next to. Not just a nurse who had saved a child's life. A warrior. A legend. Someone who had walked among them for weeks as a ghost in scrubs. The Rear Admiral's eyes found Laura's across the corridor. He didn't salute her. Officers don't salute Master Chiefs, chiefs salute officers. Instead, he gave one small nod. Recognition. Respect. The next words out of his mouth changed everything. Holloway would later tell his daughter over dinner, because in the next 75 seconds, 2 naval intelligence officers in dress uniforms entered Seattle General from the main entrance, and they didn't stop at the security desk. They walked directly to the central monitoring station where Dr. Whitfield was standing, chart in hand, looking at the trauma intake notes for the new admission. Dr. Whitfield, the senior officer said. His voice was the sound of a door closing. You are relieved of your position effective immediately. Whitfield's head snapped up. On whose authority? The United States Navy. Master Chief Bennett was operating under federal orders on a classified security assignment. Your termination of her employment compromised an active intelligence operation. The officer's phone came out. A file. Additionally, our audit reveals you've been concealing equipment failures and outdated imaging technology for 18 months. Federal funds were allocated for those upgrades. Equipment that would have identified Petty Officer Hayes' son's meningitis immediately. Where did that money go, Doctor? Whitfield's face cycled through 4 colors in 5 seconds, pale to crimson to something gray-looking and hollow. I have board support, he tried, and that's when the second officer leaned in. Your board members are currently being interviewed by federal auditors. 2 of them are cooperating in exchange for immunity. The news cameras arrived before Whitfield finished asking for a lawyer. Someone had tipped off the local station, probably Holloway, probably intentionally, because some acts of justice require witnesses. The footage captured Dr. Whitfield being escorted out of Seattle General in handcuffs, federal agents on each arm, his mouth open in a final protest that no one heard over the sound of camera shutters and the rain hammering the portico. It went viral in 40 minutes. Medical license suspended by sunset. Investigation opened into insurance fraud related to the equipment scandal. His wife filed for divorce the following week with a statement released through her attorney, I didn't know who I was married to. By the following month, his name had become a cautionary tale whispered in medical education programs, the administrator who tried to bury a diagnosis to hide his own budget failures and nearly got away with it. Laura watched the whole thing from a 4th-floor window, her face showing nothing at all. The Rear Admiral found her there 15 minutes after the federal officers escorted Whitfield away. Your cover assignment is complete, he said quietly. The diplomat's daughter is being transferred to a secure facility within the hour. New security detail is in place. You're cleared to resume normal status. Laura just nodded. She didn't ask what normal status meant for someone who had spent 2 years pretending to be ordinary. She didn't ask about reassignment or extraction or whether anyone had even noticed she was gone. She just watched the rain and held the Rear Admiral's gaze for exactly long enough that he understood, I know what I sacrificed. I know what I saved. Now leave me alone. Over the following months, Portland's public records told the story of Dr. Whitfield's collapse like a medical chart documenting organ failure. The insurance fraud investigation expanded to include charges related to falsified equipment maintenance records. A forensic accountant found $487,000 in hospital equipment funds diverted to a shell company registered to his brother-in-law. The licensing board suspended his privileges permanently. By month 6, there was a photo in the Oregonian, Dr. Whitfield sitting at a folding table outside a strip mall, selling life insurance from a cardboard banner, his suit wrinkled, his hair gone grey, waving at passers-by who looked away. Laura drove past that mall on a Tuesday morning. She wasn't looking for him. She just happened to see the banner out of the corner of her eye. Her car slowed, not because she wanted it to, just the muscle memory of threat assessment. She saw him. His hand came up to wave. His face went white when he recognized her. His hand froze mid-gesture, the wave becoming something like a surrender. Laura didn't slow down further. She didn't make eye contact. She just let her car drift past him like he was already a ghost, a man who had once held institutional power and spent it on cruelty and lived to see the day when nobody would even pretend to shake his hand. Then it was a week later, and Laura was walking through Seattle General's front entrance in a different uniform, not scrubs. The jacket with the insignia. The rank visible. The uniform that said she wasn't hiding anymore. The board had appointed her their new director of emergency medicine, appointed her in the kind of desperate scramble that happens when institutional credibility collapses and the only person who can rebuild it is the one who was right all along. Her first official act was approving Commander Hayes' request. The ceremony took place in the pediatric ward at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday, with Ethan standing beside his father and 20 hospital staff members arranged around him like an honor guard. The boy was fully recovered. His meningitis had cleared. His seizures had stopped. His hearing aids were adjusted perfectly, and he was signing now with the confidence of someone who had nearly died and decided living was better. Laura knelt to his eye level, and Ethan's hands moved slowly, carefully, each sign formed like he was carving the words into the air. Thank you for saving my life. His tears came first. Then his father's. Then Laura's composure fractured for the first and only time in her public life. Her eyes welled. Her mouth trembled. Her hands moved in the sign she had learned from Ethan during those 72 hours of visiting. You reminded me why I serve. Holloway saluted from the back of the room. The Marine surgical nurse who had recognized her suturing technique saluted. The respiratory therapist and the phlebotomist and the cardiac nurse with the Marine Corps tattoo, they all brought hands to hearts. Even some of the civilians understood what they were witnessing, not a ceremony for a patient's recovery, but a homecoming. Laura stood, wiped her eyes once, and looked at every person in the room. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together, she said, her voice pitched low enough that everyone had to lean in to hear. Remember that. You never know what someone has survived to stand in front of you. You never know what they've given up just to be here. Choose kindness. Choose to really see people. Because you might be standing next to a legend and never know it. Later, in her new office on the administrative floor, Laura placed the tarnished challenge coin on her desk next to her diplomas and commendations, that coin from her unit in Baghdad, the one that had sat in her cup holder for 2 years, the only piece of her real life she'd allowed herself to carry. Her phone buzzed. A text from the Rear Admiral, diplomat's daughter secure. Well done, Master Chief. She allowed herself the smallest smile. The kind of smile that came from knowing she'd been right. Knowing she'd saved 3 lives instead of just 1. Knowing that sometimes the bravest thing wasn't wearing the uniform, it was hiding long enough that people forgot you ever were. Below her window, the ER floor hummed with familiar activity. Nurses moved between patients with the quiet competence she had once hidden behind, and now she could be both the warrior and the healer. No more choosing. The camera lingered on Ethan through the pediatric ward window, laughing silently with his father, alive because one nurse refused to stay quiet when it mattered most. Alive because Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett carried more than secrets under her scrubs. She carried the kind of love for the work that survives even when everything else falls apart. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value, subscribe and share this. Because the real heroes don't usually announce themselves. They just show up and do what needs doing. And sometimes they save lives in the quiet, where nobody's watching but the people who matter most.